All right. So thanks for having me over. It's really exciting to be here. And thank you everyone else who's joined us today, this evening or morning, wherever you are, and enjoy your drinks. So I'm going to talk about a topic that's very dear to my heart. It's about cities. And the idea is that cities need smart planners, not smart technology. I will talk about an example of urban inequality, specifically in access to urban infrastructure. Um, as Rob has already mentioned, my name is Trivik Verma. I'm an assistant professor at Delft University, and I'm also the director for Center for Urban Science and Policy. So urban inequalities basically is prevalent all over the world. It's everywhere around us. This beautiful imagery, yet very devastating imagery from Johnny Miller shows that it manifests as a process in space. You can actually visualize it, you can quantify it, and you can see that communities are living side by side next to each other in very drastically different conditions around the world. And it has nothing to do with whether it's a Western nation or someplace in the so-called global South. Everywhere around the world, these inequalities are very prevalent. Now, it's also estimated that by 2050, about 80% of human population will be residing in cities like these. So if we don't do something today or something right now, we will probably see more and more urban inequalities prevalent around us, and definitely more and more spatially visible. It doesn't matter whether it's about rising sea level and lack of urban spaces, or there's forced displacement and migration because of wars, famine, or food scarcity. And of course, economic inefficiencies built into our systems. We're so dependent on consumption and resources today. All of this leads to growing energy demand in cities, and all of this leads to a lot of inequalities. So urban inequality is as important and grave a challenge as climate change. A lot of people say that. I agree. But these problems, whatever perspective you take, more and more people are thinking about addressing them in a smart manner. People are thinking about building smart technology in our systems, connecting everything, connecting the world as much as possible with efficient technology, smart technology, where resources are available at your doorstep. Resources are also sustainably used and transported, et cetera, et cetera. So you're looking at a picture like this, perhaps in the future, in 50 years, where everything is connected in your urban space, all the way from your airport travel arrangements to land use, to mobility, to waterways, to energy being generated inside the sea. And all of this is very easily and nicely transported to this nice cluster of buildings here in the middle of the city. But also in this picture, there's a grim view on the right side of the image, where you see that there are, in an abstract notion, there is a colony of people who are removed from this connectivity, who are removed from this hyper-connected world where everything is accessible and useful only to a certain few sets of people. Now, credit goes to KSP pumps. They made this advertisement possibly for their own water transportation systems. I'm just using it as an abstract philosophical view of the future as I see it today, is that if we don't do something about it, our urban inequalities are going to galvanize more and more in the future. So this begs the question, what do planners do typically? How is urban planning done now, and how is it moving towards in the future? I think three key principles are part of urban planning: is utilitarianism, neoliberalism, and the fact that planning is very disintegrated in today's reality. Now, this is no comment on specific planners who are trying to change things. World over, planning is disintegrated, and that's not hidden from anybody. But what I want to talk about is the overarching principles or values that is embedded in the planning. So from the focus of utilitarianism, it's always about bringing benefit to society as a whole, not looking at the underlying disparities and trying to mitigate that for several communities who don't have the same economic benefits or even the same social justice allotted to them. And then there's another value of neoliberalism, where planners typically attract a lot of capital and a lot of resources for their cities. The focus is to attract all of this for affluent workers, for rich workers who are of a certain kind, highly educated, who are coming to the cities to bring more economic benefits. So it's all about the economy. This example by Stephanie Farmer on the right side, it shows how Chicago's been planning its city for a long time, where they focus only on developing transport systems for affluent workers, for business workers, trying to get investments through airports, through trade ports, where a lot of business people come into the city and do trades and investments and other kinds of exchanges. And the central line of this train has been built just to promote more and more of those investments. So it's a very neoliberal attitude where the investments focused only on affluent workers. And as a result, a lot of the communities in the city, especially in the north here and in the south, especially in the north here and in the south, never really got a chance to be connected to the city as a whole. So they were left out. They still live in deprived regions and deprived conditions. And that's just one example from a city of Chicago, happens across different domains and different sectors in multiple other cities around the world. Now, planning is also disintegrated. So every planner thinks about their own domain or agenda, whether it's about energy, whether it's about mobility or a third kind of thing, but it's never really thought about as a whole, where there is no acknowledgement to the fact that city is a complex system. These effects are never linear, they're always compounded. So if you do something or design for one aspect, even if it's good intentioned or for the benefit of some kinds of communities, sometimes those design aspects lead to inevitably pushing communities out of their home regions. For example, gentrification. So you do something good for a community, but then because of that creation, construction in the region, and not working with social housing, for instance, a lot of people will be displaced. So they will not be able to access the benefits of that region anymore, maybe in 5 years or 10 years down the line. So planning's focused on all of these principles, and a lot of the benefits are not distributed in a manner that acknowledges the disparity in the way that people are living. So I want to take a second to talk about the central point here, which is cities are complex, and that's why these things don't really work in the benefit of all the people. Jane Jacobs, a very interesting American scholar, talked about the complexity of cities, especially in a book in 1961, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, where she acknowledges that it's problems of organized complexity. Now, on the left, you'll see how all of that organized complexity can be conceptually created or cataloged. Basically, cities is this organized whole where we are dealing with simultaneously with a huge number of relationships. It's wastewater, energy, food, materials, consumer goods, all coming together in terms of how they flow in a city. It's about the infrastructure, buildings, utilities, transportation infrastructure, and how it's organized in a city, who has access and who doesn't. And as a result, it's about the socioeconomic characteristics that evolve out of those kinds of access or lack of access for a lot of communities in the city. But there's also the top-down effect. So there's states and governments and institutions that basically decide the rules or regulate a lot of the infrastructure, a lot of the movement of people and interactions between people in the city. And you can think of all of these interactions as being complex, but when they come together, they are an organic whole. Why they are an organic whole is because in science, we have the ability to study these processes and actually describe the manifestation of these processes, whether it's about innovation, about housing, employment, infrastructure, or any kind of indicator of life in city in terms of simple numbers and equations. So on the left, you'll see that I've plotted an abstract diagram of any kind of urban indicator from innovation all the way to infrastructure. And on the horizontal axis, the population size of a city. And as the sizes of cities increase, basically these indicators replicate similar kinds of patterns. So it can be explained by similar processes. It doesn't matter, irrespective of the size or scale of the city. Because we have the ability to study these processes using a huge number of data sets, different kinds of data sets, different timelines, and it doesn't matter where they're procured from or how they're created, we can study all of these processes, which is what it's basically urban science and policy is. It's the science of movement of people, of goods, information, services, and how they all come together and how these things interact with each other to give rise to something as beautiful as a city where a lot of different things go on every day. So this is what we study at Center of Urban Science and Policy. Every time I talk about these things, it goes without saying that it's not just me. It's a lot of different people who contribute to the efforts of projects that I'm going to talk about today, or in general, creating the center and making sure that we are on the right track, thinking about these problems. So Together, our mission is to affect change in planning and policy in a way that we focus away from technology. We focus away from thinking that technology is going to solve our problems and focus on people and communities and what their needs are. And so thinking about the requirements that they have and then designing in a more integrated, non-neoliberal manner so that people get access to things that they deserve and they come for in cities. Okay. We focus on three things, basically three themes of research in Center for Urban Science and Policy. The first one is urbanization. So all of the different kinds of interactions between social, economic, environmental, political processes. One example here is we study the impact of Airbnb, which is, let's say, the impact of bringing a technology company or using wealth creation and accumulation in a city on the processes of gentrification. So who has access to this kind of new technology, who doesn't, who benefits from it, who doesn't, and how does it transform the way neighborhoods are in comparison to what they were before the advent of that technology. The second theme is anything to do with inequalities. Particularly today, I will talk about this one in terms of access to infrastructure and how access is segregated around the world. So more on that later. And the third theme is about participation or participatory processes in planning. So here, one of the example projects is we focus on identifying the conflicts between social and spatial values in a city. People could have different priorities. Planners could also have different priorities, and it's often required and important to understand where they have conflicts and how to resolve those conflicts in order to design for everybody and taking care of everyone's needs. We do this in three different ways at the center. So the first one is thinking about data, working with data, and that's why it's basically a data science lab. We focus on extracting insights from different kinds of data sets across space and time. So the more data we have, the better it is, obviously, because then we can understand processes more broadly. We can understand the time or spatial relationships between these processes. The second is thinking not just by ourselves, but in a transdisciplinary manner. So if you're working on energy, it's not always about that. It's also about something that energy affects. It could be about demography. It could be about political relations with the energy market, and so on and so forth. So it's always trying to solve problems, working with other people in an interdisciplinary manner. The third one is more of a visual thing. So we are focused on trying to explain our complex models with simple insights and invest a lot of time in effectively communicating these through innovative visualization techniques or ways in which we can really explain complexities of models in simple ways to decision makers, because otherwise there is no point of doing this because nobody will understand. Okay. Now, how is all of this possible? Coming to the more fun and interesting things of data. All of this, urban science and policy, has a huge background in data, and data has been around for a long time. It's nothing new, but it's also the thickness of the data. Traditionally, data has been used in social sciences by employing a lot of wide-scale experimentation, a lot of processes that are detailed, that help us collect data for a specific purpose. Experiments around data is curated and created. And this kind of machinery, for example, is very rich and detailed. You can think of census bureaus like CBS in the Netherlands or US Census Statistics. They employ a lot of people just to think about these experimentations, just to collect this data over a long period of time. So these are detailed information about communities, about people, which gives us access to information that we need to understand what's happening in a city for various problems. So that's why it's thick, because it's really detailed in information-rich profiles and portraits of the city. And it's also high quality. You can have visualizations, maps, statistics, and access to a lot of different things from these data sets because they're designed for trying to query those kinds of information. But this thick data is also built around massive enterprises. So if we want to do a new experiment tomorrow, we can't really create a new enterprise. We can't really create that infrastructure just to study something about society. It really has to be thought through and has to be developed for a long time. So that's a negative point of view on this. It's also coarse in resolution. because it has to preserve privacy of people. We can't have access to census information and get to everyone's private details, so it has to be coarse, also geospatially coarse. And it's of course slow because access and the frequency or how they're available is not so easy to access. Especially GDPR compliance in Europe is quite high compared to other parts of the world. Some examples, like I said, census, but also surveys designed in social sciences, typically interviews that are very detailed and carried out by scientists or decision makers, and of course, indicators built and developed and tracked over long periods of time. But urban science and policy has also gone through a phase of big data, where this fancy term means a lot of different things, but basically, new sources are appearing in an accidental manner. So, for example, Twitter. Jack Dorsey didn't think of creating Twitter for scientists or decision makers, just created it for selling ads. But the analysis is possible, right? We can still look at that data, especially recently, a couple of months ago, that data has been accessible for the rest of the world for free. So we can think of a lot of different kinds of analysis to do with such data sets to understand human behavior located geospatially in cities and to learn more about how people move, for instance, and so on. It's also very diverse in nature. Resolution differs, and it's much more detailed in space and time because with our phones, hyper-connected world, we can track a lot of different things, also anonymously sometimes, which is good and bad, of course. I'm not going to go too much into the connotations of that, but it's still diverse in nature and important for researchers in urban science. Quality also varies greatly, and of course, so does the misuse. Here you can see in terms of quality, quantity, etc. Paper was invented in China, and now we have the cloud. I don't know, centuries later in 2006, where the way that data is collected and the infrastructures it has made possible for us to really study a lot of different issues in cities with more focus and resolution that we'd like to, and we can create more knowledge about the interrelationships. So there's a case to be made for more integrated urban policy because now it's possible. Okay, coming back to urban inequalities, just wanted to give you a pitch about what we do and how we do it and how data is important. But coming back to urban inequalities and how we study it and how we tackle it. Basically, urban inequalities is, as I said, prevalent around the world. I mean, this is just an example of history from the United States, how neighborhoods were redlined, how districts were segregated. There was loan discrimination for these districts, and there was also racial zoning laws that were in place. So there's legal cases to be built decades ago where inequalities were actually built into the system for a lot of communities around the world. And this is not just in the United States, happened at many different places for various reasons, etc. But what's interesting is that these inequalities are rooted in access to spatial infrastructure, to essential infrastructure. And this access actually defines our ability to get better education, to be able to access good healthcare, to be able to create ties with communities and build social resilience, to access different kinds of choices of food, which is healthy food outcomes are good for communities, especially for their health, and also to have an active lifestyle. So when people don't have this access, a lot of detrimental factors also manifest together with that, right? And a lot of social science literature, dotted social science literature, case study-based social science literature has shown that good access can improve quality of life of people. They can seek upward mobility and they can get out of poverty. So we were thinking about all of these ideas and how to use our data sets and think about urban inequalities. And we came up with the question of how do we identify urban inequalities around the world, across many different cities? How do we compare them to understand who has what and how much? And how do we start to think about the notions of equity and social justice, whereby we would like to mitigate these urban inequalities, making a case for planners around the world to think about mitigating these urban inequalities on a large scale. So the example that I want to talk about quickly is from Chicago again, and I'll show what we did in this project. Question we asked ourselves is how do we identify and compare these in access to urban infrastructure? It's pretty straightforward. we calculated something called an active accessibility score. We used OpenStreetMaps and a bit of network analysis to calculate walking distances to any amenities of interest for different communities in a city. The most important thing was to calculate the walking distance from any community in the city, but also take into account the attractiveness of that to the resident. There are a bunch of categories of basic amenities that we thought about here and collected using OpenStreetMap data. It's about mobility infrastructure, health and well-being, hospitals, pharmacies, etc., education, so schools, universities, colleges, active living, food choices, community space for better socially resilient communities, and also choices for entertainment that exist in cities as well and are part of our lives. So the way that we calculate this active accessibility score, I will describe that here. So think of dividing the whole city's spatial area into a bunch of hexagons. We divide them into equally sized hexagons just so that we can compare accessibility and, of course, control for land. Because if you have a bigger region, you will, of course, your accessibility will be worse off. Maybe you have to travel more. And if you have a smaller region, it's easy to just quickly go to the next door shop. So to compare and control for accessibility scores across different parts of the city, but also across multiple cities, across different kinds of methods of planning that have given rise to these different accessibility scores, we divided this into a bunch of different hexagons. Here you see 3 as an example, and you see an example of the road network or the street network of that city. The green ones are the intersections. So these ones here are the intersections of the road system. And the red ones here are types of amenity, whether it's about mobility or something else. We calculate the distance from each intersection within a hexagon to the nearest amenity type C. We average that distance. And then basically the formula here, distance equal to WCDC's summation, says that we aggregate the scores of these distances across different types of nearest amenity for a particular hexagon. So for each hexagon, we know how much do you have to travel on average from these different intersections to your neighboring amenity of type C. And then we subtract that from 1 after normalizing and taking a log, just to be able to get a score that's comparable in terms of both within the city and across. So here you see, again, accessibility score on the left side for Chicago. The yellow or the brighter parts of the graph show that these are highly accessible regions. So you can easily go walking distance or take a bike to your nearest amenity. Whereas there are also parts here that are darker in color that show that accessibility is quite poor in these regions. So that begs the question, who are the people who live in the spots where you have good access, and who are the people who live in the spots that has bad access? Well, we did some social group analysis. We used the census data of people living in the city of Chicago, plus an algorithm called consensus clustering. Here we find out groups of households and how they're closely related in their demographic attributes. So the way we cluster these hexagons again is by saying that their census variables, namely mode choice, income, education, rent, and the ratio of minorities that live in a particular hexagon, are they similar to other hexagons? If they are, they belong to the same kind of cluster. And if not, they belong to different clusters. And this algorithm gives us 5 or 6 different clusters for each city, depending on what are the disparities in mode choice, income, education, and so on. And so using that, we found that when you put them side by side, it's clear. The areas of high accessibility are also showing a certain kind of community has that high accessibility. So it's this community here that has high accessibility. And what is interesting now is to look at what are these variables or indicators of these communities that have high access. So we divide these 5 groups, and I just show here 2 of those social groups, the least vulnerable and the most vulnerable. The attributes speak for themselves, but most vulnerable has low income, high ratio of minorities living in those regions, have low education or low degrees, and a lot of high unemployment. They also pay very low rent because of the kind of social housing or housing that they live in. Least vulnerable is completely opposite of that. Now, in this plot, for the two social groups, you see here is the density distribution of accessibility scores. So on the left is less accessible and on the right is more accessible. And you see that people who are in the least vulnerable group, they have very good accessibility. Whereas the ones who are who have less accessibility, or their median accessibility is around 0.6, are also in the most vulnerable group. Right. Now we divided these factors or these social group indicators by the various variables. You can see accessibility is different, of course, but what's interesting is that the other variables are completely opposite of each other. So education levels for these two groups, low education, completely low education levels for the most vulnerable, high for the least. Minority population exists only in the most vulnerable, not in the least ones. And median income, of course, is also drastically opposite to each other. Now, this, one could argue, is just an artifact because it's Chicago, but it happens all over the world, and we can measure it because of this big data infrastructure that we've created. We've created this pipeline where all of this census data, accessibility scores come together, and any city in the world, it's possible to do so if you have variables of social group analysis for that city using the census data. So these kinds of inequalities are prevalent in all parts of the world, no matter which city it is. We did this analysis for 54 cities and found that it's quite a bit, even in Western nations that have good planning or good infrastructure, good access to services. For example, cities like Den Haag. Now, this open source architecture can now help us measure and compare access to this infrastructure. Numerous data sources on the top row are used to then study what are the active accessibility scores, where are the amenities, how is the pedestrian network laid out. Then we create social profiles using consensus clustering here in this row, carry out the accessibility analysis here, and then compute average accessibility scores within the hexagon cells. And finally, the most important thing from a planner's point of view is identifying communities that are undermined either by accessibility policy inadvertently or just historically speaking, they've been left out or they've been pushed towards the periphery of cities. So how do we find them? How do we mitigate those problems is the next question. Well, how can we provide more livable and accessible spaces for those people? Numerous things are in play from a planner's point of view. Transit-oriented development is an interesting policy where you focus on building a lot of cluster of amenities close to transit infrastructure so people can access it. Also housing close to transit infrastructure so people live in the same place, have transit infrastructure around, have amenities close by, and then can go also to another part of the city using that transit infrastructure. Smart mobility options exist. Shared mobility services are now being let out into the world in many different cities. But what's really important is to think about what are the consequences of these kinds of policies in isolation. We must account for the socio-spatial and temporal implications of how these things actually manifest in space. For example, Airbnb or Uber, who has access to it? Are these regulated by political institutions in a manner that there is some equity in the distribution? Are they allowed to be present in a city in a way that things like, or processes like gentrification are not going to push communities out of the city centers? So it's important to think about a few things. I've just laid out three here. Those who don't use these smart technology are not in the data. They're never going to be served by it. Those who cannot afford it will not use it, cannot use it. Those who are displaced over the long term, they're never thought about because we only focus on bringing investments and think that it will trickle down at the end of the day to everybody. Now our goal is to think long term. This is just the first part. It's to identify and to compare, but somebody also has to mitigate it. And for that, we need to compare and create frameworks in a way that we can also study the impact of our interventions. So here we are focusing not only on the physical infrastructure, but also thinking how those physical infrastructures bring impact into people's life and how we can monitor them over the long term. To address, to understand social outcomes and also to address positive social outcomes for a lot of communities that don't have them generally. So this is a project that we are starting now with my colleague Juliana, who's also here. But this is for the future. Okay, with that, I think I'm done. I don't know if my slide has moved on because I'd like to invite you all to something. Here's an event that we are organizing together with my colleagues at CUSP. It's called Citizens Collective. It's a series of talks, discussions, conversations, reflecting basically in the first series on urban inequalities. We are interested in cities and future of cities. So the first one is on urban inequalities. And there'll be a person a week speaking about different topics from mobility to sensors to technology of different kinds to gender to urban-rural divides, etc. And the first talk is about who counts in the smart city by Professor Rachel Franklin. So if you're interested, you can look at either the website citizens-collective.org or take a photo of this barcode and scan it later. Or I can send the presentation to Rob and the team later on. And as my final slide, don't know if it has moved. Oh. Surprise. Okay.
Yeah,
just wanted to leave you with the message again. Cities need smart planners, not smart tech. And if you want to reach out to me, here's my info. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you for the interesting talk, Trivik. There are actually some questions. I'm not sure whether people want to ask the questions themselves. Rob, do you want to ask your question yourself, or do you want me to read it out loud?
Yeah, I can do it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was a bit related to the first part of your talk, Trivik. Overall, very nice insights. So thanks for the great talk. I was wondering, over the past year, we've been working from home a lot. And I think that's changed the way in which we work, and perhaps accessibility and travelability becomes a little bit less important. Do you think that the new way of working will cause or has caused a paradigm shift in how we plan and use cities?
Yeah, very interesting question. I think there are a few things at play here. I've seen a lot of people discussing post-pandemic cities. Definitely, there has been a change. A lot of offices have shut down permanently. I think Shopify in Canada has shut all of its offices worldwide. It's a huge retail company, but has asked its employees to work from home now. And they only have a few small warehouses where people can go and work if they need to. So those kinds of things will affect a lot of the times the way that people choose housing, for instance. Families would tend to move out of cities, I think, because they'd like to have more green space and better schools for their children. So I think we'll probably see weird and different kinds of scenarios happening all over the world differently, depending on local contextual histories. But at some point, people would like to go back as well, because I've also seen people, on the other hand, are interested in getting back to work. Not everyone's interested in working from home. So I think we'll find a new equilibrium. I can't predict what it will be, but we'll definitely find a new equilibrium at some point, maybe in a couple of years, where you have a hybrid form of working. It's okay to work from home because clearly it has been, but also it's okay to have some kind of social contact. So I think that there will be some kind of hybrid versions coming into play in a lot of places. On the other hand, a lot of communities who have, for example, low accessibility or just live in deprived conditions, they have service kind of work. So they have to get to work every day, right? So for them, infrastructure would, I think, become more important. And it'll possibly also be that you'll see a lot more people coming into cities because in the last year and a half, a lot of people have lost jobs and have seen very worse conditions. So for those communities, I think it's important to keep in mind that access is going to be more important than previously.
Right, cool. Thanks for elaborating.
Okay, on to the next question, which actually received the most upvotes in the channel. And this question is from Abhijit, if I pronounce it correctly. Do you want to ask your question yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Hi. Thank you, Trivik, Dr. Trivik, for the session. That was eye-opening. I mean, I work in enterprise BI, so it's always refreshing to see data being used to what I think solve real problems than help corporations make more money. But the question I had, and I think it touches upon the last part of your presentation. So maybe you might not have the answer, or you want to save it for a separate talk. We spoke of the dark spots on the map where accessibility is limited. But my question is that if we bring that accessibility to those areas, let's say urban planners do it, are we not just risking gentrification? So I think that's what you touched upon. How do we do live monitoring of those changes to ensure that the changes we make are actually impacting the people we mean to impact, and not just inviting, let's say, more affluent urban professionals and just increasing the urban spread of the city while continuing to push people out. I speak because before I arrived in the Netherlands, I was in Bangalore, and this is very common in Bangalore. This is exactly what happens. It's an IT city. As IT firms expand towards the outskirts where you assume that development must happen, it's just, your construction industries come in and it just gets built up, but the poor just keep getting pushed out further and further.
Yeah, that's a very
or we have slums. So I mean,
yeah, that's a very good question, and also there's a lot of nuance at play in India specifically. But I think you touch upon a very important point, which is what I touched on at the beginning, which was of disintegration in planning. So the focus is always, okay, it's transportation, so it's your avenue and you focus on transportation and we don't care. This is your budget and you focus on transportation as a policy advisor for transportation itself. And those kinds of, or that kind of thinking leads to these kinds of outcomes typically across the world. So if you want to make sure that gentrification or displacement of people doesn't happen over the long term, I think first and foremost, it's important for planners to have a consolidated view of these things, how urban relations actually factor into place. If you're going to do this, how is gentrification going to manifest in 5 years? If that community needs protections and safeguards, then how do you do that working together with social housing? Making sure that development from builders and infrastructure that's more private or affluence coming from outside the city does not disrupt those people's lives. So I think integration in planning is very important. I know a few decision makers in The Hague who really vouch for it, who say that we need to have a global observatory in order to understand how everything's related to everything else, and planners have to work across the board with each other, can never work in silos. I think to a large extent that thinking is prevalent in the Netherlands, at least in The Hague, I've seen that. But at the end of the day, it's about money, so it stops, right? It's about money and your goals, and then no matter what you do, the planner goes on and does their job, thinking about the economic benefits and not about equity and also egalitarian values, where you want to distribute benefits in a way that's proportional to the inequalities that are already existing. So that's very important to put into the thinking of planners from now on. And I think the other side of it is when people are displaced, I was made aware of this from a new PhD student who's joining us, in fact, soon, that when people are displaced, social housing tends to be pushed outside the city where there's no access. So the promise is that you are going to be displaced to a better place, a better housing colony, especially in India. This happens. It happens in South Africa. It happens in Sweden as well, which is progressive, right? But these housing colonies, maybe they are better just as housing, but they have no access. They are far outside the city, far outside the urban centers. So people can't work, and that's useless for them. And so they go to more deprived conditions after being displaced. And thinking about these things requires planners to work together.
Does this answer your question?
It does. I don't know if it's related though. It's actually, I had one more question that I posted, Christy, that's, I guess, related to the previous one. It only has one vote. Is it okay if I go ahead?
Yeah, of course. Go ahead.
So I just got thinking when you mentioned the point about how you saw the same behavior across 54 cities. So the slide was showing North American cities, but you've gone ahead and done it across the globe, and you said you saw similar behavior. Is this not a blessing in disguise? Because if we're seeing the same problem, could we not templatize the solution and kind of have a framework that can be reused across the globe?
Yes and no. I think it would be reductionist on my part to say that yes, the template exists. We've created the template, right? We can show the planner, here's the problem. But I don't think it's entirely in the hands of the planner to also incentivize creating all of these amenities in neighborhoods. They can create maybe transport infrastructure because they're funding for it, but they can't create schools that are more private, for instance. Or if there are private schools, they can't force them to reduce fee for vulnerable communities, right? So I think it also requires thinking from the social science perspective, which is, I have very limited knowledge of that, but we are trying to transition into it, is something called social impact assessment, which would then depend on the reality of the place. What does the community need? Can we make an intervention that's in the benefit of the community and then actually assess the impact over time? And for that, I think we need composite indicators that are more related to that region, that acknowledge and quantify the reality of that region, whether it's about energy poverty or it's about access to mobility or it's about something else, problems of that specific region. Once you've identified where the problematic regions are, then you can work in a way that you work with communities, engage communities, invest in solutions that are more local. So it's not about top-down planning, but also working with communities bottom up to engage them, to give them the ability to work on it themselves, provide them funding, but let them figure that out as well, is I think part of the solution. And then measuring and studying this impact over time.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I guess there's time for one short question. Bruno, do you want to ask yours?
Sure, although I think it's already kind of been answered, so I'll just take this time to say that I really enjoyed your talk. But maybe to summarize it, so there's also a lot of cities that do not have a lot of public infrastructure yet, so mostly in the developing world. And what would be your pointers for where to start planning these things to improve the quality of life for the whole city?
Good question. I think now we are venturing into my personal opinions and philosophy.
We are, yes.
Yeah, I think it's important to provide public transport infrastructure, first of all, because people come to cities or urban spaces for movement and mobility, right? And providing cheap, accessible public transit infrastructure, laying the backbone is very important. Providing education, access to education for everyone is very important. So those kinds of infrastructure are really important in cities that may not have it, or if you think of developing your city, these kinds of infrastructure are really important. Less than bringing an IT park, infrastructure technology related jobs, or creating entertainment and lifestyle kinds of things just for the affluent and rich workers. It's important to focus on the labor class, which is primarily, I don't know, 70, 80, 90%, or the majority of people living in any city. Doesn't matter the size of the city. So we cannot escape these inequalities, right? In mathematical sense, there will always be inequality. Not everyone will have the same wealth. People will have more and people will have less. So the curve will always be upward, where some people have more and some people have less. It's about trying to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor and actually lifting the poor from poverty. And for that, they need access to infrastructure that's important, that gives them opportunity and capability to do better for themselves. So I don't know if that answers your question entirely. I'm just thinking about it, but transportation that is cheap, low cost, sustainable, of course, and then opportunities to be able to study and to work, things like that.
Thanks. It does answer my question, by the way. Thank you.
Correct.